Ready? Hit the button. Wait. And we're live.
See, there was that moment.
Yeah, and I'll give it to you, Ben. There was definitely a moment. There is. So Ben's been running the back end of the show, and I'm just in the process of finally getting acculturated into running the back end of the show and all of the various streams and setting up the broadcast. And Ben has kind of been watching like a father, like teaching his child to like drive or something. And there's like these regular kind of like moments of like, oh, watch, but you want to be careful when you shift there because like people might be crossing the street. And so
is he patient and overbearing?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So, and we're live. It is Wednesday, March 17th, 5:03 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. I know, Ben. I know. And
I mean, what does that do to our guest?
And
you have marginalized our guest by making East Coast time centric. If we had just had Universal time, we would all be on the same footing.
I don't know where Jacob is right now. But we are here in lieu of fun with Jacob Mchangama. Thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be a good hour. What are you drinking, Jacob?
I'm trying to finish this
bottle of olive oil.
No, it's a single malt Scotch whiskey. It's called Tomatin or something. I didn't know it, but it's quite good.
Is it good?
We'll see if I'll get to the bottom of this or.
Well, hopefully this interview won't be that bad. But cheers. Ben and I had started in lieu of fun on the premise that we would be drinking Scotch every day, and that just morphed into like a different type of drink every day.
In fact, today,
what are you having? You're having beer.
I am drinking a special beer. Today, an accredited member of the deep state drove over to my house and delivered to me.
This is your monologue.
Yeah, this is the beer monologue today.
Yeah.
And delivered to me 4 bottles of the double impeachment ale from the Deep State Brewing Company.
That's amazing. You should save one of the bottles.
And so this is the second batch of IPA, but the first double IPA that the Deep State Brewing Company has brewed. The first one, I think, is actually, I shouldn't speak the name of the beer on In Lieu of Fun. But the second one was brewed during the impeachment, the second impeachment. It's a double IPA, and so it is the double impeachment ale IPA.
Is it good?
It is quite good.
But with a bitter aftertaste.
It's got a little bit of a, that hoppy aftertaste. It's and so I want to say, to the brewer of Deep State ales, help has arrived, and the insurance policy paid out. And so we are on the road to recovery. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. Democracy has triumphed for now. And so cheerio.
Yeah, that sounds delicious. So delicious. So does that Scotch, which kind of makes me wish that I had a bottle of Scotch on hand right now. I'm like not in the mood for mulled wine. Is it good?
Yeah. Tomatin. Tomatin, yeah.
Highland is it peaty? What kind of Scotch is it?
Yeah, it is, but not overtly so. It's I think it's quite good. I got it from I think my father-in-law, and it's to my liking. I can recommend it.
Great.
Excellent.
So Jacob, we have like lots to talk about. Last time that I hung out with you was when we were taping, I think your podcast with doing it with Daphne, so it's so nice to have you on, and to trade favors. And this is, I guess, what I kind of wanted to start out talking about was a little bit about your background and how you are and where you are right now, and kind of like tell us a little bit about yourself and like how you got doing what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So right now I'm in Copenhagen, north of Copenhagen. I was born and raised in Copenhagen, though my father is from the Comoro Islands in East Africa, and he may be the reason why I'm doing sort of human rights stuff, because when he was a young student, he was protesting first French colonial rule, and then the dictator that took over once the French were out, and that put him in prison a few times. And actually, since he returned, he's also been thrown in prison a few times. So that might be one of the reasons why I got into to this line of work. But sort of, I would say that my sort of obsession with freedom of expression probably came through when the whole cartoon affairs blew up, where little cozy liberal Denmark became sort of the epicenter of a global battle of values over free speech, and
So for our audience that isn't, can you kind of talk a little bit about that, and I can drop some links in too.
Exactly. So on 30th September 2005, the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten published 12 cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. Actually, not all of them. Not everyone knows this. Not all of them were depicting the Prophet Muhammad. Some of them were actually poking fun of the newspaper, because some of the cartoonists thought that it was a ridiculous thing to do. But this escalated into, as I'm sure many of your people watching knows, into a huge global crisis with deaths, and we still have people who are living with round-the-clock security, who are on various Al-Qaeda death lists. And actually, the attack on Charlie Hebdo in 2015 was more or less because they republished some of the cartoons and supported Jyllandsposten. And I was living in cozy Denmark. I was taking free speech for granted. It was not something that I thought about, because it was like the air that you breathe. And then suddenly, people are willing to kill for it. And also it sort of made the free speech debate, to me, it became a bit schizophrenic, because some of the people who saw themselves as sort of the heirs of the Enlightenment values were suddenly queasy about defending free speech, because they saw these as cartoons as punching down, and basically as marginalizing a vulnerable minority, and therefore some would say that this was not really what free speech was supposed to do. So and to me that was not a persuasive argument. I very much think that poking fun of religion is at the very core of free speech, and it really doesn't matter which religion you poke fun of. And also it doesn't matter whether you like, there's nothing inherently wrong with being offended by a cartoon. There's nothing wrong if you're a religious person to say, hey, I don't think this is funny. I think this is crude. This is you don't have to defend sort of the content of a cartoon, but the idea that you're not willing to defend a cartoonist for publishing something when they're faced by death threats in a secular liberal country like Denmark really shook me. So that is why since then I've spent so much time on free speech.
Yeah. So I'm kind of actually curious. So like that, like I forget like the kind of this, like I haven't looked at these in a long time. And I think that like the Charlie Hebdo kind of moment was when I got read in more on the entire Danish controversy. I don't think that I really knew about it until the Charlie Hebdo moment happened. But I'm very curious as to like, I mean, I take your point really well, which is that like, the whole point of freedom of expression is really about, especially like something like the First Amendment, is I think about enshrining a right to speak against power. And whether that power is the church or that power is the state, you have to have that that ability to speak. That being said, the Danish cartoons happened in the wake of September 11th, in the wake of an anti-Muslim kind of worldwide crackdown against kind of terrorism and other types of activity. And, there was a real threat that a lot of Muslims were feeling at the time, and I think still feel a discrimination and how they practice their religion and like and the depictions of their religion. And so like, I don't feel like I can take those. I'm not Muslim, but like I can look at those cartoons and not be offended by them. But I'm curious how you kind of like how you in your mind thread the needle on something like that between like, people being targeted based on kind of comic depictions of them and it turning out to be a human rights issue in and of itself.
Yeah. So first of all, I would, I would distinguish between poking fun at a religion and poking fun at Muslims as a group.
Yes, I think that's a super important distinction. No, thank you for saying that.
So that and even though I don't think hate speech should be criminalized, I'm certainly not in favor of poking fun at Muslims as a group or engaging in hate speech against them. But my position is very much that when you're a minority, free speech is the most important guarantee for your safety and your well-being and your ability to flourish in a society. And we've seen that in Denmark. So various Muslim groups immediately said, this should be, at the time we had a blasphemy ban in Denmark. It was never really used, but people were arguing this should be criminalized, people should be charged. My position was always, listen, you're a minority, and then why would you want to undermine the very rights that allow you to practice a faith and engage in religious speech that a lot of people in the West find offensive or don't like and would actually like to ban? And this is also, what happened in Denmark. A lot of people on the right during this cartoon crisis were sort of free speech is absolute, Muslims just have to suck it up. And then what happened was, after a number of terrorist attacks and sort of exposure of some quite radical imams around Denmark, the right-wing parties in Denmark then proposed and enacted a number of laws that were more or less specifically targeting the religious speech of Muslims. And that was just, to me, it was just so predictable. You go out and you undermine free speech, freedom of religion as a minority. What's going to happen when some kind of moral panic ensues? It's going to target the minority group.
So I want to ask you about what the free speech landscape in Denmark as a baseline matter looks like, because we look at things from the US perspective, where kind of all of Europe looks a little bit half-hearted in this free speech department. But we also have oddities of our own free speech jurisprudence, like that we include in it things like campaign spending that the rest of the world kind of rolls its eyes at. And so, in Germany, Holocaust denial is not within the ambit of free speech. There are various limits on free speech in Europe that are kind of unthinkable in the United States. But what's the baseline against which this debate is taking place in Denmark? What are the categories of speech that are presumptively regulable or bannable in Denmark that aren't in a US framework?
Yeah, so if you just look at our constitution, it's basically sort of for the lawyers out there, a Blackstonian free speech protection. So it basically only protects against pre-publication censorship. But it's more or less an absolute ban against pre-publication censorship. But under the Constitution, the Parliament could tomorrow say, you can go to jail for lifetime for criticizing the hairstyle of the prime minister, and that would not violate the constitution. But then, there's a strong political culture, especially after World War II, of really saying, even extreme speech should be tolerated. And then, of course, we have the European Convention on Human Rights, which protects, which also protects, which is not limited to just pre-publication censorship protection of free speech. But I would say, even though we don't have sort of a Brandenburg versus Ohio standard of legal protection, I would say Denmark is probably one of the European countries that has come the closest to that. So we've had communists in parliament, we've had neo-Nazi being able to have the legal, Holocaust denial has not been banned. Nazis could walk in the street. You had Islamist political associations, but we do have hate speech bans. We had a blasphemy ban, which was not really enforced. And we have laws that criminalize the glorification of terrorism. So not just incitement to terrorism, but glorification. And then we've added these things that I mentioned about religious speech. But interestingly, in the past few weeks, we've seen a development, and actually I would say in the past 5 or 6 years, I think we've seen a worrying development. And so the last example was, so we had this well in the US, there are certain people who are not convinced that coronavirus is a real thing, and that
the president of Tanzania, who was one such person, just died of it today.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have
that really happened.
Yes.
Oh wow! I did not know that the president of Tanzania died of COVID today. That really happened.
After denying that that is real. Yeah. Okay. That's
why can't that happen to Bolsonaro? I don't understand. Sorry, not allowed to say that probably. But go ahead.
Yeah. No. But that's and they protest lockdown measures and so on, which is of course political speech. But they burned in effigy our prime minister, and then they included these words that could be interpreted as a threat, but were really a play on words on things that our prime minister had said when she decided to cull all minks in Denmark, in violation probably of our constitution. And these guys were arrested under sort of really draconian parts of our criminal law, sort of crimes against the constitution and the government, and they're in prison and remand, and been in prison and remand for like 8 weeks, which I think is really, really worrying, because in my view, this was not a real threat. This was a political protest that was distasteful, morally objectionable, but should be protected speech. But then the police took it one step further, and we had this woman who protested against. She thought that this was a violation of free speech, so she made a Facebook group where she protested this, and then she posted the picture of this effigy burning of our prime minister. And then what happened? 2 police officers came to her home, arrested her, indicted her, and confiscated her phone and laptop. And to me, that is quite a worrying development.
So let's talk about that development, okay? And let's talk about the fact that you've been what kind of kicked off your interest in all of this was the events in Denmark around the comics in 2005, which I never knew. Actually, it was kind of always interesting to find out about people that you're friends with or that in this space. You're like, oh, I don't know how they got here, but that's interesting to know. But it's been 16 years since those events happened. And the world has changed a lot. There is more and better kind of control of speech. And there is also kind of more access to speak and to listen. You have smartphones, which were not ubiquitous in 2005, that are certainly ubiquitous now. You have high-speed internet. You can upload video immediately, everything else. I really do wonder. I'll tip my hand a little, as I just got done teaching jurisdiction to my internet law class. And now I'm in the speech section. And one of the things that I'm wondering is as I kind of go through all of these cases, is I kind of wonder, are we hurtling towards this balkanized internet? Are we hurtling towards an internet in which we make the rules for what we want the speech to be based on jurisdictional, like traditional nation state jurisdictional lines. Now, if that sounds like what could possibly go wrong, like, let me give you a very real world example, which is that, like, let's say that you pick up the New York Times and you want to cross the border into Toronto, and you want to read the New York Times in Toronto, and you also want to read it in Buffalo, New York. And like, let's say that, like, in this kind of world that we're imagining, such things might be geo-blocked by various things. So you couldn't read certain types of content inside Canada that you could read in the US or vice versa. And it's like someone basically taking all of your newspapers away, or like taking your newspaper away as you cross the border or something like that. And that seems like inherently wrong, right? We don't think that way around knowledge. We don't like confine knowledge to like these geographic boundaries, yet we do confine and understand sovereignty to be within boundaries, and for like various populations to be able to create the laws of their land and like see what they want to see and not see what they don't want to see. Are we moving towards like a balkanized version of society in your mind, or are we moving towards a society that's the opposite of that, and instead moving towards kind of a communal understanding of what free expression is, like across the entire world?
Yeah, I would just add that Toy Tank's point that it's already kind of that way for video in the chat is exactly right. I mean,
right.
You cross a border and your Netflix is a different.
We're really good at doing this when money interests are on the line, right?
Exactly.
Like IP. Like, no, this is completely correct. And I point this out all the time in my class, but like for obvious democratic reasons, Michelgonian reasons, even I would argue Blackstone wouldn't disagree with this. Like John Stuart Mill wouldn't disagree with this. Like there are lots of reasons to not break up basic knowledge and not tie knowledge to the market in that way.
Sure. I think that it's probably more towards the balkanized version. The sort of the NetzDG, the Network Enforcement Act that Germany adopted in 2017, which says that social media companies, for instance, have to remove content that is in violation of German law within a specific time limit. If it's manifestly illegal, then within 24 hours, or risk huge fines. So we, at the think tank that I run, we did this study where we looked at how many countries have sort of tried to do the same, and we identified around 23 countries which have more or less not copy-pasted, but done more or less the same. And a lot of these countries are it's like Turkey, Russia, Belarus, Venezuela, they obviously they specifically refer to the German version, but then it's basically but using their own criminal laws, for instance, saying these are the limits, so you have to respect Venezuelan or Russian law. And I think it's quite unfortunate, because even though it's a good faith effort by the Germans, who are of course very worried about free speech because of their reading of their specific reading of their history, which says that free speech is very dangerous. And maybe we can discuss whether that's a good reading or not. But it sort of legitimizes some of these efforts that helps the balkanization of the internet along those lines, and I think that's quite unfortunate. And of course, the European Union with the Digital Services Act is trying to do perhaps some of the same things. And in Denmark, we have lots of political parties who want the same type of laws. But it's quite, it's obviously it's not a new discussion. We've seen how countries have tried throughout. So if you go to pre-revolutionary France in the 18th century, you had this battery of censors who tried to keep out Enlightenment thoughts to protect throne and altar against these dangerous ideas. And then basically you had these analog VPN systems where people would say, well, this was printed in Cologne or somewhere, and then it would be smuggled across borders. You had basically the Dutch Republic was in the book that I'm writing on free speech, I call it the Dutch dark web, because it was basically it was much freer in the Dutch Republic, and so a lot of things were printed there.
Freer for Protestantism.
Yeah, well,
the Dutch Republic was not the greatest place for sort of Catholic social thought.
Comparatively freer, and certainly much freer than France at the time.
I want to ask you about the current American sort of free speech controversy, which is a curious one because it does not involve the power of the state. But we've had a rash of people losing their jobs at media organizations for either the choice of words that they use or the use of racial slurs, or for, in one case, defending the idea that one might use such a slur in the context of reporting about the use of the slur. We've had a major political party kind of adopt opposition to what it calls cancel culture as a sort of significant plank of its political existence, but none of the cancel culture in question, assuming one buys that that's what it is reflected by state power. It's all private actions by universities, by media organizations, by social groups. And so my question is, how should we feel about this in a free speech context? Is this, from your point of view, is this private actors holding each other accountable for things they say is itself a kind of free speech? And if the New York Times doesn't want to employ Don McNeil or doesn't want to make his life especially comfortable and he resigns after he uses the N-word, this is really nobody's problem but his own? Or is there something to the, sort of like anti-cancel culture anxiety that there is a kind of toxic conformity that is being imposed upon people, albeit not by state power, but by something else that is threatening free speech through these incidents? It's not people breaking into Charlie Hebdo and killing people, but it is social pressures that lots of people are feeling to one degree or another.
Yeah, I think that's I follow it that debate as close as I can, and I think it's a hugely significant one, because I strongly believe that free speech does not merely depend on its legal protection, perhaps not even primarily on the legal protection. You know better than I that if you look at the legal protection of the First Amendment, you really have to get into sort of the late 60s before you get really robust protection. And if you go back into the early part of the 20th century, states could get and even the federal government could get away with a lot. And how do you change those laws? How do you change the First Amendment? Well, those are underlying changes in attitudes as to where the line should be drawn on free speech. But I think John Stuart Mill actually is a good place to start. So I'll read this quote from On Liberty, where John Stuart Mill says, "Protection, therefore, against the tyranny of the magistrate is not enough. There needs protection also against the tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling, against the tendency of society to impose by other means than civil penalties its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them." So actually, I would say that what motivated John Stuart Mill to write On Liberty was very much the social conformity of Victorian England at the time.
Yes.
There's also a very strong current in George Orwell's writing.
Mm-hmm.
So George Orwell said he was surprised by how lax censorship was in Britain during the war. The real danger came from centralized ownership of newspapers by a few wealthy men, and by liberal opinion, where he said, you can't go out and criticize the Soviet Union and communism because the intelligentsia will shut you down. And and so I think and then the difficult question then becomes, when is private censorship, in lack of a better word, when is that problematic vis-a-vis free speech, and when is it just, as you said, free speech? Because free speech must necessarily include the right for people to disagree vehemently. So and
to not publish things they don't like.
Of course, but I think there's a huge difference between, if I say something, if I write a piece that people find disagreeable on Twitter, then they criticize me, mock me, that's fine. I might not feel great about it, but if you want to participate in the public debate, okay, you have to accept that people might find that you're jacket. But if you say, I really don't like what you're saying, this guy should be fired, then are you really engaging in free speech, or are you trying to penalize them? And I think Jonathan Rauch has written really great about this in Persuasion, about trying to narrow the term of cancel culture, because unfortunately this debate in the U.S. has really been captured by what I call Milton's curse. So basically,
by Milton's what?
Milton's curse. So John
Milton's curse.
Yeah, because John Milton is celebrated. He's celebrated as this.
I've heard that before.
He's this. He's celebrated as one of the first people who was in favor of free speech. He wasn't, but I
believe he's the author of the quote, "I mean not tolerate papists,
exactly.
Then we exterminate."
Exactly. So basically, for John Milton, it was just like Reformed Protestants should be allowed to
should tolerate each other.
Yeah, exactly. They should be allowed to, and
toleration for most of us, and then
exactly.
some not of us.
And also, just like he was against pre-publication censorship, but he also said, if you say something outrageous, burn the books. And so to me, that's Milton's curse. It's like, yay, free speech is important, but only really for the ideas that I find are that I like, and not those that I find.
I have a follow-up, but Ben, you follow up first.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so my point was just going to be that I find all of this fascinating and exactly right. I think that actually, like, things like the First Amendment are 99% of the time completely irrelevant to like the debates that we're having around free speech and free expression right now. That most of it is driven by social kind of constructs and norms that we're creating around free speech, and that's because, frankly, law cannot kind of react quick enough to meet the changing norms. And I think because we haven't gotten to a place in which we have either the technology has settled out in such a way that we have a consistent world that we can have reliable outcomes based on what we put out into the world, knowing how it's going to be used. And so I think that like that has been reflected in kind of this like these moments of like kind of like social like kind of changes you're talking about from like the Milton's curse kind of perspective. That being said, there are some really interesting things that in particular, it's actually really funny that you quoted On Liberty, because I was just saying, Ben, today to Alan Rosenstein, who is previously an Lieu guest and a writer for Lawfare, but I was just on the phone with him and I was saying like, how much I've been so distracted in like covering all of the oversight board stuff that I have to go back to first principles and have to go back and read On Liberty and have to go back and read my Meiklejohn and like have to go back and read all of these like decisions, because I just have felt that I've like lost touch with them. But you saying that reminded me, sorry for the long-winded response, but you saying that reminded me very much of kind of this greater idea that I kind of had attributed to James Madison and Madisonian ideals. And this is from like the founding of the American Republic, which is that Madison observed kind of the true nature of a majority rule in kind of the House of Representatives in Virginia, and then goes back famously to Philadelphia and like urges them to like create a Senate, to create a House of Lords or some type of thing, because the fear of a majority like controlling, and this emotional majority controlling, and not will stomp on all of these like kind of minority factions and everything else. And increasingly I feel this way in this moment of free speech. So I'm actually kind of looking down the road for the next couple of weeks and next couple of years, I guess, and looking at things like the Oversight Board. And if the Oversight Board comes out with a decision that says that Donald Trump needs to be reinstated on Facebook's platform because a private company taking down a democratically elected leader is really problematic, and especially without any prior warning or any types of like kind of like notifications. And if they say that, and there is this huge global reaction against the Oversight Board and against that decision, I don't know that Facebook is going to hold up what the Oversight Board says, like this small panel of global experts that has been barely tested against something like a mass reaction to like permanently ban Donald Trump that comes from the rest of the globe. And I'm not sure that that's good for free speech or democracy globally. And so, you know, and at the same time, people will say, well, this group isn't accountable, everything else. But I'm really curious to hear what you'd think about something like that and what you think might happen.
Yeah, well, I don't know what will happen, but and I think, you know, I think the Oversight Board is I think it's a noble experiment. Lots of people are hating on it, but you know, I think why not try something? You know, content moderation at scale is never going to find some equilibrium that everyone agrees on. So we might as well tweak. But all in all, I think, you know, my reading of the history of free speech is that, you know, free speech tends to do better when you have a more decentralized distribution of information and opinion. It's really interesting to go back and read Tocqueville on free speech in America, because he says basically on the one hand that, you know, America is so vastly different from 19th century Europe, because in 19th century Europe, after the excesses of the French Revolution, censorship was just across the board. Even in Britain, there was very harsh restrictions on free speech. But he says no one in America dares restrict this press. Now, that was not exactly true, because if you went to the South, you could be killed for publishing abolitionist newspapers. But he says that it's only the excessive dissemination of newspapers that basically saves American and gives vitality to American democracy and stops sort of public opinion from overwhelming the individual. And of course, the size and impact of Facebook makes this harder. So I think right where we are now, I would prefer probably a web that was more decentralized. Now, how do we get there? You know, lots of people are much smarter on the infrastructure and the architecture. But sort of, I get misty-eyed when I think back to the blogosphere, right? You know, where you had sort of a more horizontal web than now. But you know, I think, you know, if we were looking at the Trump decision through the eyes of someone like Mill and George Orwell, as I tried to do in a piece that I wrote, I think they would be in favor of him being suspended at the time, while things were getting out of hand, but perhaps more skeptical about a permanent suspension. That's my own opinion on how it should be. So sort of say, you know, things are going out of hand. You're not actually trying to stop these people from attacking the very heart of democracy. So we're going to suspend your account now. But do we actually suspend you? Also, in lieu of the fact that the most incendiary of his comments were not made online, they were made at the rally in
So one question before we go to audience questions. I'm curious whether there's any parallel to the US cancel culture debates in Europe right now. It seems to me that the European debates have a different, at least the ones that I've seen, have a sort of a different valence, which is, first of all, there's situations like the Prophet cartoons issue, right? Which are, should the state allow publication of hate speech? And then there are, of course, the cases like Charlie Hebdo, where people or groups are violently responding to perceived or real hate speech. But I haven't seen a lot of examples in Europe of what we're arguing about here, which is sort of, local private enforcement of speech expectations that are, not being state enforced and not, is that just kind of not being talked about transatlantically and happening all the time in Europe as it's happening here? Or is the question in Europe more focused on the state than it is here?
I think there is some debate about this in the UK, for instance, and especially when it comes to universities. I've also seen a number of Guardian columnists, I think at least one who lost her job due to some comments, and then of course J.K. Rowling, who's been the subject of quite.
But J.K. Rowling has been subject of criticism and anger. But she doesn't have a job to lose, right?
And pretty uncancelable.
But isn't that
so five people haven't bought Harry Potter,
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was like, so that the mass marketing campaign that is Harry Potter and all of it. But like, isn't this sorry, I didn't want to cut in. I want you to answer Ben's question, but like I wanted to add to Ben's question, like this idea of like, isn't it all about power and money then? Like, isn't it all, if like J.K. Rowling can't be canceled because she already has the power, because she already has the money. Like, and she already has the voice. Like,
but
she
that
has
would be
it
true
in
if
herself.
she were here too. If she lived in Kentucky,
yes,
or
that's
in
true.
New York.
Sorry.
So, I'm trying to isolate whether the nature of the free speech debate is different in Europe because there is actually the constitutional option of restricting it. And so if you had the Danish cartoon situation arise in the United States, you would have an immediate discussion of whether the editor of the relevant newspaper should be sacked. And you would have a free speech debate that would not involve the state. It would simply involve the private decision to employ should the cartoonists ever work again, right? All of these are private sector decisions. Whereas in Denmark, because you have the constitutional option of punishing the speech itself, there's immediately a policy discussion about whether or not to do that.
Yeah, I think you're to a certain extent you're right in the sense that people can then try to ask the state to intervene and say people should be punished. But I think these, as so many other cultural phenomena, this trickles down from the U.S. to other countries. This is one of the developments that I'm less enthusiastic about. There's a lot of things that I like about the U.S. Not this development. But to me, it's not whether J.K. Rowling is uncancelable. It's more about it's also sort of the what does it say about the underlying commitment to tolerance in the general population, and also this idea that I see increasingly that specific opinions are, dangerous to people. That it puts them at physical danger. And I'm not saying speech can certainly lead to harms, but I think a lot of the in a lot of the context that I see it, being furthered, I think they're pretty fanciful ways of arguing. So if that idea becomes prominent, that to me has very negative consequences for the idea and the vitality of free speech in any country committed. And again, look at someone like Spinoza, for instance. Like he didn't only fear.
I just want to say, in your beloved Holland,
Exactly.
super tolerant Holland, I believe, was where he was excommunicated.
He was excommunicated, but he also, like he said, he had this correspondence with one of his friends, and he said, I'm not going to publish this because then all these hardcore Orthodox reformist preachers are going to come after me with their hateful ideas, and I hate quarreling. He basically just wanted to write these very grand abstract ideas and not get into quarreling. And so this is definitely something that we've seen throughout the ages, and there are obviously a lot of things that today we would say this is uncontroversial, that would lead to controversy earlier. One of my favorite examples is in 1917, Columbia University fired 2 professors because of their anti-war opinions. And so the New York Times wrote an editorial which praised Columbia because academic freedom certainly did not include the right to espouse radical and socialist ideas. And I think they actually used the term safety. If you go to I think it was.
Did they wait? They really couched it in safety at the time about socialist ideals.
Yeah, definitely.
But at the time, was there kind of a moment of like unrest around communist and socialist ideals and protest that seemed more now we look back and are like, sure. That seems so crazy.
That's always the case, right? When we look back, when we look back at the various Red Scares, we tend to think, why were we so intolerant at the day? But at the time, but then 1917, there were revolutions. You had the
anarchists were blowing things up in the United States. I mean,
exactly. But still, firing 2 professors, and you get also the safety argument by this guy who's called. I think he was called Benjamin Hendricks. He was a professor at I think it was University of South Carolina, and he was a Republican in the 1850s probably, and so he was anti-slavery. And what happened? His effigy was burned at campus, and there was this campaign by Southern newspapers to have him fired, and he was fired, and he had to leave. I think he even had to leave the state. So we see these examples of quote unquote cancel culture being used for very different purposes, and a lot of them we would say, well, that's just shows a complete lack of tolerance, and that and then so we have to ask ourselves, if we engage in it today, is that progress? Is that merely criticism? And again, I think criticize all you want. Of course, you don't have a right not to be mocked. You don't have a right not to be criticized. That's part and parcel of free speech. But there's a difference between that and then asking someone to, demanding that someone be fired because you don't like their opinions.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating kind of. I think that the calls for firing or the calls for some type of disagreement are like the calls for outcome, for some type of outcome related to speech that is separate from the speech itself, for the speaker to be punished in some way, is like a really interesting circumlocation around the issue of censorship. Like, I think it lands you in the same place ultimately, which is that people don't want to speak out because they don't want to lose their jobs. That said, we have to wrap on time today. because Ben has places to be and big. And I just want to say how much I love America. Look at my I'm just like flanked by eagles today, flying.
There's a
liberty.
suggestion that we should have a poll of how your eagles would fare against my rhinoceros.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's a great poll. I can totally do that poll.
Meanwhile, I think Daniel might be getting like Alice worse than Alice has ever been Aliced.
No, trust me, this is not as bad, Ben. Trust me. But go ahead, Daniel. So nice to see you. Go ahead and ask your question.
So Ben has touched on part of the question that I was going to ask. I'll ask the second half, which is in terms of positive examples with respect to free speech laws. What do you think the U.S. can learn from the rest of the world, and what can the rest of the world learn from the U.S.?
That's a very good. In terms of law, I think I think it's, often when I talk to Americans, there's this free speech and the First Amendment has become this almost like sacred religion, and that and people think of it as something that has provided robust protection against free speech throughout American history, which, as I alluded to, is just not correct. So I would say not to take it for granted. And also, I think one of the things that I would, especially at this point of time in American history, where there's so much discussion about race, and where I see the argument being made that free speech is weaponizing racism, I think without this hot winning streak of First Amendment cases led by the NAACP in the 50s and 60s, the First Amendment would not be the First Amendment, right? And so
no, not at all. In fact, all of those cases really did lead to incredible decisions that are foundational for the doctrine.
And tomorrow is 18 March, and that's exactly 101 years ago. And this is not about America, but it's the same principle. Mahatma Gandhi was put on trial by the British for sedition, and he gave this rousing speech where he really said, he basically made an argument that comes close to defining free speech as the First Amendment is today. And tragically, what you see in India today is a lot of the laws, colonial era laws that were used by the British to convict Indian nationalists like Gandhi and Tilak and others are now being used by the Modi government to punish its opponents, like this young climate activist she's being charged with basically a hate speech and a sedition law that comes from the British colonial era. So I think free speech is super important for minorities, and I would really hope that in the debates going forward about racial justice in the U.S. that more people would use that, see free speech as a guarantee for and basically that freedom of speech and equality goes hand in hand, rather than they're not mutually exclusive, they're mutually reinforcing. Obviously free speech does not guarantee that you don't have racism. It doesn't eliminate racism, but if you look around the world, I would say that countries that protect free speech, which means a commitment to minorities, by definition, I think that's a crucial guarantee. Go back and read Frederick Douglass's plea for free speech in Boston, probably one of the greatest speeches ever.
I love that speech.
About free speech, where he says, very strongly that slavery and free speech cannot coexist. He says in another speech, free speech is crucial, especially for the oppressed. And I think that sums it up.
Yeah, so fascinating. Okay, Zoe is the reason that Jacob's on the show today. Not because I wasn't already aware of his brilliance, but because Zoe reminded me of it, and because you and Ben and I know that we just get distracted and whatever, we just lose track of who we're going to invite in the show, and it just becomes easy. And so this was the impetus. But Zoe, thank you for recommending Jacob, and go ahead and ask your question.
Wait, so he's muted.
Mm-mm.
Yes.
No, she's not though. She's not. She shouldn't be muted. I'm not muting her. We can't hear you. No.
You can
You
read
want me
your
to read your
lips, though.
questions? I can read your questions though. Let me do it. Hold on. Unless you can figure out a way to unmute yourself.
No, she's gone.
No? No, Zoe? No, nothing? Okay. We can't figure it out. Can't see you. No. Okay. I will quickly read her question. Her question is, long-time lurker, first-time caller. Why do people obsess over the daylight between the First Amendment and international human rights? That is Article 10 of the ECHR and Article 19 of the UDEHR, when quite frankly, any of these would be more speech protective than what we have right now on platforms. So like, why are we being academic about it? I love that question.
I think there's a very good reason to be academic about it, actually.
Why?
So, first of all, I am a fan of the First Amendment by and large, the First Amendment jurisprudence, as opposed to the international human rights speech standards for state purposes, with certain exceptions. That said, if you applied First Amendment standards to Twitter, a huge amount of stuff that I really want to come down,
yes,
stays up.
Yes,
Including, by the way, all the bot stuff, right? That stuff is First Amendment protected. If
spam is First Amendment protected, then bots are certainly First Amendment protected.
Yeah, and so I do think the private actor here the distinction in First Amendment law between what a private actor can do and what government can do is doing an enormous amount of work in everything that we do with content moderation. And if you say, and that it's going to do more work if you're applying much more work if you're applying First Amendment standards as something like the Oversight Board than if you're being informed by international human rights law standards. And so I do think if the goal here is to say we want maximum free speech from government, but we want companies on their own platforms to have a fair bit of latitude to design reasonable content moderation policies. And by the way, it's going to be different if it's the Orthodox Jewish social media site than if it's going to be the Scott Shapiro cancel site than it is going to be if it's going to be Facebook, right? But all of those things, if you have to choose one body of law, I think it's actually important to choose the more forgiving body of law with respect to free speech, to speech regulation.
What do you think, Jacob?
Yeah, no, I also just because, international human rights law is, funnily enough, international, at least claims to be. So it has more legitimacy than trying. It wouldn't make sense to take sort of the First Amendment, which is the absolute outlier, and say, okay, this has to be reflected worldwide, but that comes, then you come back to the whole idea of decentralization, because if you had more decentralization, then we wouldn't have these discussions, because content moderation wouldn't be as consequential if you didn't have a platform with 2.7 billion people as Facebook does now.
The one thing that I'd say between both of you is that I agree with Ben entirely that you'd want the most forgiving of social platforms that lets private actors do this. But the one thing that I would say about both Article 19 and the First Amendment is that there was no belief at the time that those were written or created that there would be private actors that could even come close to leveraging the type of power that they have now. And I have said this for a while that Facebook is stronger than any one nation state. I think it's stronger than the entire EU. I think that the entire EU could cut off or try to ban Facebook, and Facebook would be just fine. Facebook would still turn a profit that year.
But I think a lot of good work has been done to strengthen the ICCPR. But
Yes.
I'm very schizophrenic about it, because if you go back to the drafting history of Article 20, which is the hate speech clause, it was the Soviet Union who championed it, and Eleanor Roosevelt was really fighting to keep it out. And none of the Western, not a single Council of Europe state voted in favor of Article 20. And basically, those types of laws were then used by the communist bloc to punish their own populations. But I think like people like David Kay and others have done a terrific job in really narrowing it down.
Yes.
The Obama administration, when it re-engaged in the Human Rights Council during the defamation debacle, in this fight about defamation of religion with the Islamic countries of the OIC, set in motion a process which has really narrowed the restrictions on free speech in international human rights law, which is why I'm also much more comfortable with it today than I would have been 10 or 15 years ago.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, David Botts, you are the focus and you are the last word. Thank you for your Ides of March homage. What we have Jacob's Clear and Present Danger in the corner. This is Jacob's podcast. Everyone should subscribe to Jacob's podcast. It is excellent. I'm going to drop a link in the chat in a second. And then what is in the bottom?
St. Patrick.
Oh, is that who that is?
That's St. Patrick. So
he's
for,
less
for
green
all those,
than I thought he would be. I thought he's also less elvish or like leprechaun-y. Okay. Go ahead, David. The floor is yours.
So that was a fun topic before we hit a little more of a serious one. What should we think about the censorship and literal cultural erasure that the Uyghurs who are being held in secretive internment camps are experiencing? How do we respond to this problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and this is where I actually think, we in Western liberal democratic countries sometimes take free speech too much for granted and are too critical of social media and internet. Because if you read The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, he basically says, the Gulag system of the Soviet Union could only function because no one really knew about it. There was a lot of censorship and propaganda, so there was no publicity about it. Not even China can keep their version of the Gulag secret because of satellites, because of social media, because of the internet. I think that is probably the best way to really shine a light on this, genocide or approaching genocide, and I think that's really where I think the internet is helping us, even though China has done more than any other country to really reverse engineer sort of the John Perry Barlow ideals of the original internet to serve their own interests.
Yeah, it's like really well said. Yeah. I want to make one last pitch that I didn't mention it in the intro for you, but I do think that now that it's come up, we should mention it again. I have dropped a link to it in the chat, but Jacob has a wonderful podcast that goes into the history of free speech, and it is called Clear and Present Danger. It does not star Harrison Ford, but it is very good. And thank you so much for joining us today, Jacob. This is a really amazing conversation.
Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, Jonathan Rauch is a regular on the show, and so we will make sure to pass along your regards.
Please do. I'm very much looking forward to his new book that was lucky.
It's really good. It's really good.
You commented on it as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we were commenting on each other's manuscripts, so John is great. And thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I hope you'll have me back on again at some point.
Yeah, thanks for staying up late with us.
We would love to have you back. And, just the other day, I was complaining to our Finnish viewers that the rest of Scandinavia had produced very few in lieu of fun viewers or guests. They were all coming from Finland. So glad to see Denmark breaking through and carrying its weight in lieu of fun guest appearances.
Yes, it's awesome. Very nice to have you. Thank you so much for coming on. We will be back 22 hours and 54 minutes from now. And until then, Ben,
we don't have fun anymore, but we still do have the ability to speak freely for now.
Yes. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Wait, who won the rhino poll? Oh,
You did,
I
narrowly.
did.
The Rhinos are totally defeating the Eagles.
Yeah, okay. Well, it sounds like an NFL game or something. I'll see you guys soon. Bye, Jay.